Welcome to our Captains of Industry and Robber Barons video. We are going to be learning about a ton of things today. So I'm just going to dive right in and get into the explanation of our title. So what is a Captain of Industry? A captain of industry is a business leader that has served the nation in a positive way. They've developed efficient business practices, they've developed technology that has benefited the nation's economy, and they've helped shape the U.S. into a strong international leader. A lot of these business leaders also established universities or museums and libraries. And so these are people that had a positive influence in American society. On the flip side, you have a robber baron. And a robber baron is a business leader that would buy up or squeeze out competition, and they would harm consumers because they would have unfairly high prices, and they would create monopolies. And we'll talk about monopolies in a moment. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about businesses. Before the Industrial Revolution, businesses were run by a single person or by a family, and the business couldn't grow any larger than the family's ability to actually run it. And everything was local. You would buy and sell local. But the Industrial Revolution and railroads changes all of this, and people are able to buy their raw materials further away, and they're able to buy their products further away as well. And so you have the creation of a corporation. Now, a investor is a person who puts their money to use in hopes of making a profit. And investors put their money to use in corporations. So a corporation is basically like a business that has a number of people that share the ownership of it. So it's not just a single person, but it's multiple people that share the ownership of it. And these people share the ownership in good times and in bad. So if the corporation goes south and they fail, the investors lose no more than what they originally invested in the business. So it's not like they lose their whole life savings. They only lose what they actually put into the business to begin with. But corporations and investors are a positive thing as well, especially during this period of time, because it meant that corporations had huge amounts of money that they had access to. And these huge amounts of money allowed them to fund new technology or to fund new industries. And this really helped the Industrial Revolution kind of grow and really take hold in the U.S. You also have a trust. Now, a trust is a group of separate companies that are placed under the control of a single managing board. And this forms a monopoly. And then finally, you have the French term of laissez-faire. And this literally translates to let them do or let it be. And basically, it was a theory that the government should not intervene with the economy. So they should intervene as little as possible. And when we're talking about running corporations, you have the shareholders, which are the investors at the top. Those are the people that actually own the company, and they're the ones that have the final say on how money should be invested. So they're the ones that elect a board of directors, and the board of directors, in turn, the one that kind of run the daily business things. They're the ones that actually set the business direction. But the final say of how they're spending money is still left to the investors, the shareholders. Companies sometimes merge or create monopolies. We'll talk about that in a second. But basically, a merger is when you have a combination of two or more businesses into a single enterprise. So AT&T and Singular coming together, forming just AT&T, is a merge. A monopoly is when you have large companies that buy out smaller ones or force them out of business. If you guys are looking at this political cartoon over here, you see a man that is standing on two railroads looking over toward a guy that's standing on the third with the Erie Railroad. It's almost like they're trying to outrace each other. And the guy that's standing on the two is Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he's trying to buy out Erie Railroad. He wanted to control all the railroads of New York. He actually fails at buying out the Erie Railroad, but he was trying to create a monopoly. Now, the difference between a monopoly and a merger is just two companies coming together to form one. A monopoly is when you have all these companies that basically get together and do it almost on purpose. Like you had AT&T and Singular coming together to AT&T, Sprint and Nextel coming together for Nextel, Verizon and MCI coming together for Verizon Wireless. So you had 6 companies being cut down to simply 3. Now, I want you guys to think, what are some of the good things about monopolies and mergers, and then what are some of the bad things about monopolies and mergers? If you have 6 different cell phone companies, you have a variety of options. If you have 3 cell phone companies, that limits your options a little bit. And if these 3 companies come together and decide they're going to do something that, like, they're going to set prices at a certain level, so let's say $200, and they each agree that they're not going to drop below $200, consumers are kind of stuck in a hard spot because they don't have anywhere else to go. It's just 3 companies versus where if you had the 6 companies, you had a little bit more flexibility. So when you're thinking about your pros and your cons, think about it from the consumer standpoint and the business leader standpoint as well. We talked a little about Cornelius Vanderbilt and the railroads in that cartoon over here, but let's talk about him a little bit deeper. Cornelius Vanderbilt was one of the richest men in America, and he makes his money off of the railroad industry. Now, he creates monopolies by offering rebates or discounts. And basically, the railroad companies would offer discounts to people, and people would rather travel to the same location in a cheaper way than having to pay more money. And so the smaller companies couldn't afford to stay open. This would end the competition. It would keep the prices high because the railroad companies in a particular area would agree, like we said before with the cell phones, to keep prices at a certain minimum. And so the consumers had no choice but to travel those railroad lines at that set price. That idea is known as pooling. Now, when the government gets a hold of it, even though we had the theory of laissez-faire where they had little involvement, the government decides that they need to do something. And so you have the first federal agency created. It's called the ICC. And I just noticed that there's a typo in the word commerce. It should be COMMERCE. So sorry for that, guys. But the first federal agency is developed in 1887. And basically, the ICC could only monitor railroads that crossed state lines. So it could not make laws or control the railroads within itself, within a state, only if they crossed state lines. So that kind of limits things. But it's the idea that Congress is actually going to investigate unfairness, investigate this idea of pooling. We said that Vanderbilt was very wealthy, and I just want to show you guys how wealthy he actually was. The Breaker's home, which is at its top in Newport, Rhode Island, was actually his summer cottage. That's right, guys. That's his summer house. The Marble House, which was the regular home, I guess, was created actually by his grandson in 1892. The mansion in itself cost $11 million to make, but $7 million of that 11 were actually spent on imported Italian marble. And the grandson actually gave this to his wife as a 39th birthday gift. For her 39th birthday, she gets this $11 million home. So that's pretty awesome. And she actually would hold rallies here for women's suffrage, for women to get the right to vote. And we'll talk about that at a later date. But speaking of Vanderbilt, we're now going to move on to our next guy, either our captain of industry, Robert Barron, John D. Rockefeller. And he creates the Standard Oil Trust. Now remember, we said a trust is when you have a group of separate companies that are placed under the control of one board that forms a monopoly. And he creates his monopoly off of oil. The Standard Oil Trust basically ends competition. And so the government once again responds with the Sherman Antitrust Act that's passed in 1890. And it bans the formation of trusts and monopolies. So it seems like it's a good thing. But the issue was that the government rarely enforced this act. And so it makes it hard to say that you can't form a trust or monopoly if it's not actually being enforced. But it's also the beginning of now a trend of federal limitations on corporate power. So the federal government is getting more involved. Rockefeller is actually the world's first billionaire. That's right, the world's first billionaire, and he makes his money in the oil industry. If you're looking at this picture over here, the tank / octopus in the middle is the Standard Oil Trust. And the tentacles are kind of wrapped around different things. I want you guys to take a look at this picture, study it, and then tell me what's the message behind it. Our next fellow is JP Morgan. Now, JP Morgan takes the money that he makes in the banking industry and he uses it to buy other major corporations. So he was kind of rich before, but him buying other corporations is really how he gets wealthy. He ends up investing a large portion of it in the railroad line system, and he also becomes the head of the U.S. Steel Company. And the U.S. Steel Company is the first U.S. company to be worth over $1 billion. Now take a look at the picture below. The guy that's holding the world is J.P. Morgan. What do you think this political cartoon is trying to say? What is the message behind this political cartoon? The final fellow that we're going to be talking about today is Andrew Carnegie. Now, Andrew Carnegie is actually not American. He is a Scottish immigrant, and he becomes known as the King of Steel. Remember the Bessemer process? He takes advantage of the Bessemer process and makes a ton of money off of it. He was very well known, though, for his charity. He would give away lots of money. He gave away reportedly $350 million worth of the $400 million that he had accumulated in his fortune. So 80% of the money basically went to charities. And the thing that he was most fond of, the charity that he was most fond of, was actually libraries. And he built thousands of them. In the U.S. alone, you almost had 2,000. You had a ton in Britain, in the U.K., in Canada. You even had one in Fiji. So he had libraries spread throughout the world. And I want you guys to take a look over here. So you see Carnegie is the guy that's on the box, and he's split in two. And the caption reads, 40 millionaire Carnegie in his great double role. As a tight-fisted employer, he reduces wages that he may play philanthropist and give away libraries. So basically, I want you guys to look at this picture and tell me, is he a captain of industry or is he a robber baron? Now we're just going to shift a little bit and talk about how businesses were actually organized following the Industrial Revolution. So how do these guys, Carnegie and Rockefeller, so on, actually build their businesses? And you had two new ways of doing business. You could either do it the horizontal integration way or the vertical integration way. Now, the horizontal integration way was when you would buy companies that were in the same business. So you would buy up all the different oil companies that existed, and all these different oil companies now belong to the Standard Oil Company. Or you could do it the vertical way, where you would purchase all the things or all the steps that were necessary in making your product. So if you're talking about oil, you would purchase the oil wells, the pipelines, the tanks, the railroads, the actual stores that would sell it, and that would make your oil company. So you had two different ways of going about making money. Either you buy the companies that already existed, or you would buy everything that was needed to make your product. So that's the horizontal and vertical integration of business. Now you also had something else that was popping up about businesses as well, and that's the theory of social Darwinism. In 1859, Charles Darwin, this handsome fellow over here, published the book On the Origin of Species, and basically says that animals involved using natural selection and that only the strongest survived. So these businessmen, Carnegie, Rockefeller, JP Morgan, Vanderbilt, they take this book, the theory that he was arguing of survival of the fittest, and they create the theory of social Darwinism, which basically says that certain nations and certain races were more superior to others, and they were the ones that were destined to rule over the less fortunate, I guess. People would use this theory of social Darwinism to justify all different types of things. The people that supported laissez-faire argued that the government should stay out of private business because it would disrupt natural selection. Many of the people that also believed in social Darwinism believed that the nation would grow strong by allowing the people like JP Morgan or Vanderbilt to rise up to the top, and that if you used public funds to assist the poor, the nation would go down. So basically, social Darwinism was used to fuel discrimination, and the social Darwinists pointed out that the poverty-stricken condition of people, so if you were poor, you basically were just unfit. So social Darwinism was used in the business world in terms of explaining why it was okay for a man to become extremely wealthy and not give any money away to charity or to the less fortunate. Now I know we covered a lot of things, guys, so just be sure that you're able to answer these 6 terms. What are these 6 terms in your own words? You're able to answer these 10 questions over here, and that you're also able to explain the achievements. Like, how did these 4 men make their money? How did they become wealthy? And then, do you consider them captains of industry or robber barons? It's up to you guys. I will see you in class.